I guess if there was nutritional information, this is maybe a heavy protein session, but I promise it's going to be quite short. My name's John Elliott, and today I'm going to talk about the death of passwords. But what I'm really going to talk about, actually, from a privacy practitioner's perspective, is how what we consider something as being appropriate and reasonable to apply security today may not be appropriate and reasonable to apply security tomorrow. Um, so, so and also, I should say this, that actually, and I'm sure you're going to see this slide a lot today, which is this isn't legal or regulatory advice. If you need that, go and talk to a lawyer. So let's start off by asking ourselves, why do passwords exist? So here's Bob. Bob walks up to a computer and he types his name in. Hello, my name is Bob. And the computer says, hey, hi, Bob. But also, Alice could walk up to the same computer, type in Bob's name, and the computer, not knowing the difference between Alice and Bob, said, well, hello, Bob, which is why we have some sort of password, because Bob can type his username in, Bob, and a password. A password is a shared secret between the computer and Bob, and the computer says, well, you know the shared secret that Bob and I know, therefore you must be Bob. Whereas if Alice walks up to the computer and types in her password or a password and pretends to be Bob, the computer says, well, you don't know the shared secret between me, the computer, and Bob, therefore you're not Bob. So that's why we have passwords. Passwords are what we call an authentication factor. It's something that proves that Bob is Bob, and it also stops Alice pretending to be Bob. There are actually three types of authentication factor that we typically talk about. Something Bob knows, typically a password. Something Bob has, which could be a smart card he inserts into a slot in the computer, or it could be a number that changes on a device he owns, so he's got like a one-time password, or something that which proves that Bob owns the device, or something that Bob is, i.e. Bob's fingerprint or Bob's facial recognition. Now, we've used passwords for many years, and the problem with passwords, you've probably heard all this before, so I'll go quite quickly. We're really bad at choosing them, and we have to choose, 50 or 60. We therefore reuse them between different systems and contexts. We use the same password at work that we do at home to protect our insubstantial website that we had to register because we were shopping on. Millions of passwords have been stolen, which means that basically there's a big database of passwords that criminals have access to that they can try and when they're trying to break into somebody's system. In fact, they might have your email address and work out who you are from LinkedIn, worked out where you work, and see if the password you used from the shop where you had to type in a password to buy something is the same password you used at work. And also, we can be quite easily tricked into divulging passwords. For example, you get this email at work and you think, ooh, that's really interesting. I probably shouldn't have a copy of the July bonus spreadsheet, but let me have a look because it might, I should probably, yeah, I'll have a look. You've got that feeling of like curiosity. You click on the link, you type in your username, you type in your password. It looks like your corporate website or corporate intranet. You press the login button, but of course it actually isn't. It says, well, the password couldn't be found, but you've just given your username and your password to an attacker. And with that username and password, an attacker could log into the system as you and then encrypt all the systems. And that's very common attacks that we've seen a long time. So that was the end of the technical part of the presentation, because the question I want to ask really is, how much longer is just the use of a password appropriate or reasonable to protect what I would call personal data and you might think of as PII? Um, and the answer is, I'm not sure it's that much longer, because it's very easy nowadays for us to use two authentication factors, something you know and something you are, or something you know and something you have, or something you have and something that you are, like your fingerprint, or even all three, something you know, something you have, and something you are. And technologists call that multi-factor authentication, using more than one thing to prove that Bob is Bob. So if someone steals Bob's password, they still can't pretend to be Bob. Alice can't pretend to be Bob. A criminal can't pretend to be Bob. Or more importantly, a hostile nation state or a competitor can't pretend to be Bob. So that's multi-factor authentication. And now let's look at regulatory trends. And I'm going to kick off with GDPR, because being based in Europe, you might have guessed by the accent, but being based in Europe, GDPR is the privacy regulation that I'm most familiar with. Article 32 says this, that taking into account the state of the art, the cost of implementation, and the nature, scope, context, and purposes of processing, the controller, i.e. the person in charge of the data, shall implement appropriate technical and organizational measures to ensure a level of appropriate security. Sorry, security appropriate to risk. The word appropriate is used twice there. Appropriate technical and organizational measures and security that's appropriate to the risk. And so we ask ourselves, is a password appropriate to the risk of protecting personal data? Well, from case law or from the actions of two national supervisory authorities, the answer is not quite. It's okay at the moment for personal data, but it's certainly not okay according to the Swedish and the Netherlands data protection authorities for sensitive personal data. So we've had two GDPR regulatory enforcement cases that said a password alone not good enough for sensitive personal data, should use multi-factor authentication. In the US, you'd be very familiar with the Presidential Cybersecurity Executive Order, which basically says for federal agencies, they should adopt multi factor authentication for all access to all systems. And then finally, from a different slant, the Payment Services Directive number 2, PSD2, which requires financial institutions to provide multi factor authentication to their consumers to access their accounts and to transfer money from their accounts. So we've got three different sorts of regulators all saying, actually, MFA is a thing you should be doing now. And the second thing that you will remember from GDPR is it says, dependent on the cost and the suitability. And what I like to do is think of the cost and suitability of any technology when I determine whether it's appropriate. So if we take a graph like this of cost versus time, we take a new technology, it will generally start off as being quite expensive. But as there comes competitors into the market, and as other people work out how to deploy it, and it becomes less specialist, the cost of technology, the cost of security technologies drops. So initially, you might find a new security technology is used by in the defense world because their risk of being attacked by, say, a competent hostile nation state is greater. But then as the cost drops, that will move down to being used in the banking world. And then that technology can be used to protect sensitive data. And then that technology can be used to protect all types of personal data. And so as technology gets cheaper, it becomes more appropriate and there becomes more reasonableness of its use than not using it. So we have those two forces of what regulators are saying and what we see in the market of things being reasonable and appropriate as the cost of technology drops. Because now multi-factor authentication, MFA, is relatively easy. I put my first MFA solution in about 15 years ago. It was very complicated and very expensive. Now, there are many suppliers that supply multi-factor authentication. It's going to be easy to integrate with your systems at work, and you can even buy it as a service. So there is absolutely no capital expenditure whatsoever. You could literally deploy MFA, technically deploy MFA in a couple of days. The other thing is that we're all carrying around a device now that is provably secure. It's got the ability to prove that we are the owners of it because most of it's got biometric sensors on it. So we can prove both something we are and something we have by the use of a modern mobile phone. And so my first prediction today is this, that we are actually not quite at the death of passwords, but we're definitely at the death of passwords at a single authentication factor. And that will happen more quickly than you think. And if you're trying to control access to sensitive personal data in Europe, then that should have died by now. The second thing I'd like to really talk about is the fact that I fibbed. That MFA is actually, it's not hard, but it's not easy. I mean, it's technically much easier than it used to be, but in a large, complex organization, plumbing it into your internal systems is quite complicated. You'll have a question if you're using devices of whose devices are you using? If you're using corporate devices, it's much easier. But if you're actually rolling it out because not everyone has a corporate device, and so it's using personal devices, then from a privacy perspective, you're now deploying corporate things onto personal devices. That will be an issue. But you've also got in Europe works councils and unions to deal with. You have to work out how to get that to 100,000 or 10,000 staff, how to train them. If they lose their devices, what happens? Can they not access the system? Probably not. And then you also become you become a support desk for people losing their personal devices. And even more excitingly, that when Apple release a new phone, you end up having to be a support desk for everyone who can't access the network because they've not moved their multi-factor authentication. So it's actually quite hard to do. And so my call out to privacy professionals is if this is something that you need to start doing, it takes a while for your IT teams to do it. My second prediction is that passwords will die and we'll move to passwordless authentication, which I'm sure Julie would have liked to talk about from Microsoft, but is that something you have and something you are. So in summary, I think the death of the password as the single authentication factor is going away in the near future. But deploying technology like this, although technically much easier, is still quite hard from an organizational, operational perspective. But really, this is an example of how technology, security technology, that wasn't maybe 10 years ago appropriate or reasonable, is now seen as appropriate or reasonable. So that degree of appropriateness and reasonableness is not a constant. and we need to keep an eye on it, and we need to keep an eye on what regulators and national supervisory authorities have said. Thank you.